And we're back in the car like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your late Tuesday afternoon here with me in New York. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Today marks 110 years since the birth of the man who is generally regarded to be the single most influential figure in the history of cinema. And that would be Orson Welles. Orson Welles was a unicorn, but that doesn't really do justice to him. To try to put it in different terms, if we think of professional athletes, if we think of baseball players, the kind of almost impossible skill sets, what we call it as baseball fans, a five-tool player. Someone who does every specific different skill related to baseball, not just well, but brilliantly well. Hit for power, run, field, throw. Examples of five-tool players. Prime Alex Rodriguez was a five-tool player. He did all five of those things unbelievably well. Mike Trout, very close. Aaron Judge is a five-tool player. The ultimate five-tool player, of course, was Babe Ruth. In the world of the performative arts, where you may talk about theater, performance, writing, design, production, thought process, cinema. You might throw TV, but in this instance, you may throw radio because radio was an enormous deal. It still is, but particularly in the first half of the 20th century before TV really got going. Orson Welles was the equivalent of the greatest five-tool player in history, because Orson Welles succeeded on the stage as an actor and as a writer. He succeeded in cinema as an actor, writer, director. He succeeded in radio. There are those who think that he was the top 10 greatest actors who ever lived. So try to imagine, for example, Quentin Tarantino, who is, if you just ask, give me the best writer-directors in the history of cinema, Tarantino might be in the top 3. Top 5 for sure, as far as I'm concerned. He's not really a great actor. It's not that much of a criticism to say that Tarantino is not, Mr. De Niro or Denzel or Daniel Day-Lewis. Orson Welles' performance in his kind of signature film, Citizen Kane, could be argued as a top 10 greatest performance in the history of cinema. This was not just a guy who was great at one thing. He was great at everything. And one of the sort of crazy aspects of Orson Welles, of his career, is the first time I learned of him. And I know curriculums are different. Again, not a judgment. Curriculums change, because I learned about Orson Welles more than 4 decades ago. And I did not learn about Orson Welles via Citizen Kane or via some of the stage productions he put on, for example, in New York City on Broadway. I learned about Orson Welles because of a radio broadcast based on H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, which was so good and scary and convincing that there were thousands and thousands of people who legitimately thought the United States was being attacked by aliens. Orson Welles' infamous War of the Worlds broadcast, which was a number of years before he made his entry into motion pictures. That's a big enough deal where if that was all Orson Welles ever did, he would be taught. He would be studied. You think about today, stories which go viral, sometimes for not great reasons, but other times because they're noteworthy. That was an example of something going viral in the late 1930s, the 1930s version of viral. That one person heard it, another person heard it, phone lines start lighting up. The police departments are wondering what the hell is going on here. Are people going crazy? Well, yeah, but just not in the way that you imagine. This is not mass hysteria. Well, it was mass hysteria, but not a kind of mass hypnosis where everybody appears to be afflicted by the same bits of insanity and say, well, what happened? Is this mind control? Is this nerve gas? What the fuck are we dealing with here? But Orson Welles, another way that you can kind of see just how important a historical figure is, how many cinematic representations are there of such and such a person? There haven't been that many cinematic representations where other people let's say, made Francis Coppola a character in their film where he's not playing himself, for example. Alfred Hitchcock, Anthony Hopkins played him in a movie a little over a decade ago. Orson Welles was represented in, well, 2 movies of the 90s. RKO 281, where Liev Schreiber plays Welles. That's about the making of Citizen Kane and almost the unmaking of Citizen Kane. And then you had, in 1994, because RKO 281 was 99, but in 1994, in Tim Burton's Ed Wood, and not surprisingly, an all-time great filmmaker like Tim Burton, loved the fact that he was able to put an incarnation of Orson Welles into his movie, which I think is his best film, and Johnny Depp's single best performance as Edward D. Wood Jr., the single worst filmmaker in the history of Hollywood. Talking about someone in the conversation for the GOAT, you had the worst, Ed Wood. Well, in the world of the film Ed Wood, Orson Welles is not a critical character. He's played by none other than Private Pile himself and Kingpin, in the more recent MCU iterations, Vincent D'Onofrio. Orson Welles had such a distinctive look, such a distinctive cadence and speech pattern. It's easy to devolve into caricature, but the performers who played him did not do that. Vincent D'Onofrio, in one scene, his character, supposed to be the Orson Welles, is making the movie Touch of Evil. They're trying to get me to cast Charlton Heston as a Mexican. Orson Welles supposedly said that in real life, and he gets to do that in the movie. When he meets Johnny Depp's Edward D. Wood Jr., he doesn't know him, but maybe he heard of something that he had done, and he treats him like an equal. The representation of Orson Welles in that film treats Johnny Depp's Edward D. Wood Jr. or Ed Wood as an equal, and they talk about the movie business. D'Onofrio looks a lot like him. Liev Schreiber doesn't really look like him in RKO 281, which, as I say, was an HBO film, but he got the cadence and the canter of the speech dead on accurate. And the third cinematic representation of Welles, just in the 5-year span, Ed Wood 1994, RKO 281 1999. Tim Robbins, another kind of legendary name for Shawshank, and also there are those that say he should have won Best Director for Dead Man Walking, starring the always fire Sean Penn. Susan Sarandon, his partner at the time, ended up winning the Best Actress award. But Tim Robbins was doing something that Orson Welles tried so desperately to do: make one piece of art to try to finance another piece of art. Tim Robbins could not get financing for this film he was trying to make about Orson Welles putting on a play called A Cradle Will Rock, and all of the difficulties he had doing it. So Tim Robbins took a throwaway role in the film, which I think was, Mission to Mars, a Brian De Palma film. Not good. And Tim Robbins' role is not good, but Robbins got paid a shit ton of money. It was still the 90s. The film that he did with Martin Lawrence, Nothing to Lose, had been a modest hit, and Tim's name would still be above the titles, and he could still command, good money. And he made Mission to Mars. He acted in something that was not, I'm sorry, Brian De Palma, in this instance, it wasn't worthy of Tim Robbins' talents, in my opinion. But he was able to finance The Cradle Will Rock. And in that film, Orson Welles is played by, some of you might not know the name, the Scottish actor Angus McFadden, who, if you look fast in certain roles, he's more or less a dead ringer for Carl Urban. He looks like Carl Urban's twin brother. That's how much he looks like him. But I remember watching Braveheart in the mid-90s, seeing the film, and Angus McFadden, who plays Robert the Bruce, then he played Robert the Bruce in another movie. It's kind of weird how that works. It's sort of like, Michael Sheen playing Tony Blair a couple of times in completely different films. But Angus McFadden, I'm watching Braveheart, and my first thought is, this guy looks like Orson Welles. So sure enough, here you go in The Cradle Will Rock. I wasn't the only person who, while watching Braveheart, thought Angus McFadden looked like Orson Welles. Tim Robbins probably had the exact same takeaway. Hey, sweetie, speaking to Susan Sarandon, hey, don't you think this guy looks like Orson Welles? And the gears begin to turn. So Orson Welles represented in movies, in pop culture, a legendary name who has unfortunately been gone almost 40 years. He wasn't really that old when he passed, but his health wasn't great. And for someone who achieved so much, he's a bit of a tragic figure, because he only was able to make 3 masterpiece films, one of which was we've never seen the completed version, but 3 films where the only level of studio interference was forcing him to cast Charlton Heston as a Mexican in Touch of Evil. But Orson Welles came on the scene. RKO more or less plucked this genius theater kid, which is what he was, 25 years old, to make what became Citizen Kane. And the joke that Orson made at the time as he was preparing the film was, this is like the greatest train set a kid was ever given. Meaning, they have allowed me complete creative control. I'm just a crazy kid. But there was a sense even then, and Hollywood to some extent has struggled with this over the years, where there are certain people who should get carte blanche, but not everybody. Some people will fumble it and won't take advantage and will not make the movie that the studio really wants. In the case of Citizen Kane, it's more or less the story of the publishing magnate William Randolph Hearst. And the reason why Welles is a tragic figure, now he may have had self-destructive tendencies, like a Hemingway, if you want to go there. I would argue that Orson Welles was a greater artist overall than Ernest Hemingway, but that doesn't really matter. But Orson Welles' Citizen Kane is generally regarded to be, whether or not it's the best film, I gotta be honest, I don't think that it's that entertaining. I have seen Citizen Kane more than the next 10,000 people that you're gonna meet in your life. I have studied Citizen Kane in exquisite, explicit detail. I can do a shot-for-shot reconstruction of that film. Is it entertaining? No. Could I go the rest of my life and not watch it start to finish again? Yeah, I think I'm good. I think I'm good. But it is the most important film in the history of cinema because there is cinematic language that Orson Welles and his cinematographer Greg Toland, that they created as they made the film. And by the way, a movie that just recently celebrated its 40th anniversary, just one of the guys, the character William Zabka plays, Greg Toland, do we really think that was an accidental name? That was not an accidental name. Now, I don't know why they gave the villain of the piece the same name. It's not spelled the same, but the same name as Orson Welles' cinematographer on Citizen Kane. Well, that guy was Greg Toland, Toland. The character that Zabka plays is Tollin. But if you say it quickly, Greg Toland. This is not, again, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. They didn't randomly name that character that. The filmmakers were having fun and making a little bit of an in-joke for people like me to pick up. Wait, his name is what? Exactly. But Welles took on the lead role. I mean, it was a little bit, if Sylvester Stallone had actually directed the first Rocky movie, which we know from Stallone, he certainly could have done it. He's a fine filmmaker in his own right. But wrote the script, directed it, acted in it. And Orson Welles did all three of those things brilliantly. But the powers that be, the deal makers, the button pushers, the bigwigs in Hollywood, there was a lot of pressure on them, and the smear campaign, people connected to William Randolph Hearst, such as the late great gossip columnist, if you want to use the phrase late great, Hedda Hopper, they set out to try to destroy Orson Welles, who was still a very, very young man, 25, 26 years old when the film was released. And the only Oscar that Orson Welles won for Citizen Kane was screenplay, and it's really kind of gross. He was booed at the Oscars. That is how vicious the smear campaign against him was. Now, there are polarizing figures in Hollywood, and there have been times that people who were not necessarily always, in a negative space were booed, but usually they did something to trigger the booing, like at the Oscars. Vanessa Redgrave famously I'm not going to repeat what she said, but when she won an Oscar, she did not get booed until she said something which got her booed. Even Jane Fonda, I mean, we can make all kinds of jokes. There are a lot of the tens of thousands of Vietnam veterans who are still not Fonda Jane, right? We've all seen the jokes. But Jane Fonda did not get booed at the Oscars when she won for Clute, because she didn't say anything that had anything to do with the controversy. She said nothing. And then there were other times where people got booed because they talked about various causes. You get up there, Jim Carrey even made a joke about it where he started screaming. He says, "Don't you hate when people come up here and they make political statements or philosophical comments? I just wanted to say," and then he screamed "Viva El Salvador" at the top of his lungs. Robin Williams made a joke about that. It's just, I want to talk about the Kazan controversy, that famous year where they were honoring Elia Kazan, and then he screamed, "Let Laney sing" at the top of his lungs. So but there are instances of people getting booed for saying something that pissed off the peanut gallery. Orson didn't say shit. He stood up to collect his Oscar, and he just got booed because of the smear campaign that Hearst's people put out against him. And because of that, the film, which was quite clearly the best movie of 1941, did not win an Oscar. And it's sad to say, the Oscar-winning film, How Green Was My Valley, John Ford, and a very young Roddy McDowall, who I love because he plays Peter Vincent in Fright Night, the first Fright Night from the 80s. What a great actor and a great Hollywood character in Roddy McDowall. And his character of Hugh is pretty much the central figure in that film. But it could not have won Best Picture, and it did. But Citizen Kane was considered a groundbreaking landmark film at the time by people such as myself, the 80 years ago version of seamheads who study film the way I did when I was in school. It was not a film that took decades for people to appreciate. Like, some of Alfred Hitchcock's best films, such as Vertigo in particular, it wasn't looked upon as an all-timer and, oh my God, this might be the best film that Hitch ever made. People understood that Citizen Kane was different, that there were pioneering techniques, that there were things that were going on at the outer edges of the frame that you say to yourself, holy shit, this is extraordinary. How did he pull this off? And it's the thing that Welles was experimental. He wasn't afraid to take risks. He wasn't afraid to do different things with the camera. How can we optimize the movie camera? What can we do? I don't know if he said this out loud or if he and Greg Toland actually had conversations like this, but there are certain kinds of shots which had not been achieved until that movie. So when people talk about greatest film ever made, I've always assumed, like the Sight and Sound poll, once every 10 years, I've always took it to be, it's not just from the artistic perspective as far as do you enjoy the movie. It's what did the movie do to advance the medium, to advance the form. And in that regard, there is no greater film, even somebody who doesn't enjoy the experience of watching it, no film advanced the medium to a greater extent than Citizen Kane. So Welles' next film is a movie, The Magnificent Ambersons. He also cast, Joseph Cotten, who he had worked with so beautifully. Man, Joseph Cotten, what a fucking great actor he was. But he worked with him in Citizen Kane. And he more famously, when Orson Welles was just an actor in the fantastic post-World War II thriller set in Europe, The Third Man, where Welles just acted, but he has the one speech, the cuckoo clock speech, top 5 greatest speeches in cinema history delivered by Orson. He wrote that speech. He didn't have any part in the production of the film other than the fact that he very clearly wrote that speech. But Magnificent Ambersons, Welles finished a cut. And in this instance, it was butchered by the studio, but I don't believe it was butchered by the studio because they were out to get him as far as still with Citizen Kane. I think the studio didn't want a 2 hour and 20-minute movie. They hacked it down to like an hour and 30 something. So there are people right now trying to find the lost print, the so-called uncut or Orson Welles director's cut of Magnificent Ambersons. They're not going to find it. The movie's 80 years old. You think it's just going to show up somewhere? Now, my old NYU professor, William K. Everson, who unfortunately himself has been gone almost 30 years, he was an archivist. He was a film preservationist. He was an individual who literally rescued hundreds of films from extinction. And I'm not exaggerating. There are so many movies from the first half of the 20th century that no longer exist. You haven't heard of them, and I haven't heard of most of them either. But if anybody was going to uncover it, it would have been William K. Everson in the 70s, in the 80s, maybe even into the early 90s. I mean, he found and rescued films such as, I would say that probably the best film he ever rescued was One More Spring, which was a film with, it was Janet Gaynor and Warner Baxter. And I can't remember the name of the film. Henry King, a big time filmmaker. You probably don't know the name, but he was a notch below William Wyler. He was a great filmmaker. But when someone like William K. Everson, with all of his contacts, with all the people he knew around the world, if he couldn't find the Magnificent Ambersons, it's not going to get found. It doesn't matter. Well, Mussolini supposedly had a copy. When you hear stories like that we think Mussolini had a copy, give me a break. Like, that's so absurd. Okay, I don't believe that Mussolini had a copy. Because if he did, it sure as fuck doesn't still exist. You start to do the math. How would that work, right? But there is an Instagram page, there is social media accounts dedicated to finding the lost print of the Magnificent Ambersons. It is literally the holy grail of cinema. That's the one, if you asked 100 people like me, I hate to say something like that, but it's true. If you could have any one lost print or a film that is a lost film to some extent, what would it be? The answer is Orson Welles' cut of Magnificent Ambersons. Because the film as it exists now is still considered a masterpiece, but it was supposed to be 45 minutes longer. It was supposed to be a fully rounded portrait of this family kind of starting to come apart, I guess would be one way, you would describe it. So it's not that Orson Welles didn't work, but he really didn't get to make the sorts of movies that someone of his talent should have. He really was blackballed. And we saw, for example, Brendan Fraser was pretty much fucked and screwed for years and didn't get roles that he should have gotten. He had some health issues also, but he got blackballed from Hollywood. And there are instances of other performers who stopped getting the roles that you'd say, well, why did this person disappear? You might piss off the wrong person and then you don't work. It doesn't take much. If you are a mover and shaker, a deal maker in the industry, like a Harvey Weinstein, I hate to say it, but if Weinstein had a problem with somebody, they were going to have more difficulty getting good roles that they otherwise might be up for. So generally speaking, the last really great film that Welles made was Touch of Evil, starring Charlton Heston in a role that doesn't really make much sense that he was cast, but okay, he was cast. And Jamie Lee Curtis's mom, Janet Leigh, I guess about a year and a half or so before she worked for Alfred Hitchcock in Psycho. And Touch of Evil is a great film. And Orson was, I think he was in his early 40s, but he already looked a lot older. And yes, there was some age makeup, but Welles was about 43. And if you didn't know who you were looking at and who this guy is, you would think he was already in his 60s. Welles, I guess, had the self-destructive tendencies. He didn't take very good care of himself. I know that's a cliche, but he didn't really take very good care of himself. And so he did films like Mr. Arcaden and Lady from Shanghai, but he wasn't able to do the projects that he really wanted to. And when it got to like the 60s and 70s, especially when the kind of new American cinema cropped up and you had all of these auteur directors getting to make very personal films like Kubrick, like Altman, like Arthur Penn, like young George Lucas and Spielberg, getting to make very personal films that were pretty big budgeted and under the imprimatur of the studio banner, whichever studio it might be. There was this talk that it was just a matter of time before Welles would make the comeback that so many people rooted for. Because you think about it, there were young filmmakers at the time, such as Coppola, who worshipped Orson Welles, but it just didn't happen. And he did stuff, I hate to say, that was beneath him, but he narrated that Nostradamus documentary, which most Gen Xers saw. They used to run it in like an endless loop on HBO. I mean, it's okay, but unfortunately, he needed the money. He lived large. The thing with Welles, he's a tragic figure from this perspective of cinema, and he should have had a much greater career, literally making more great films. But Welles lived an amazing life. This is where it's almost tricky to talk about, because he was somebody who appeared with, on the Johnny Carson, Late Night with Johnny, The Tonight Show. He was a frequent guest of those shows. He was on with Letterman when Letterman had his show in the early 80s, and he never failed to hold the audience in thrall with a crazy life story of something that happened to him in the Amazon rainforest. He was a born storyteller, and even if his health wasn't great, he just had such a distinguished look to him. You see him in his older era with the beard. He was fantastic on those talk shows. And sadly, I think he was on with Carson only a couple of days before he died. And, you know, people, when they're not feeling great or when they get older, they're always asked how they're doing. And they usually make jokes like, oh, I'm doing great. And when Welles was asked, yeah, Orson, it's good to see you. How you feeling? He goes, oh, I feel terrific. And he rolled his eyes, and the audience, of course, is cracking up. But I think he was not kidding. I think he probably, not that he knew he was going to die, but he probably wasn't feeling well at all. He didn't know that he was nearing the end. Now, another thing that he did, he got paid a lot of money in 1979 to narrate the full theatrical trailer for Star Trek: The Motion Picture. Now, Robert Wise, his old buddy from Citizen Kane, Wise, who was the editor on Citizen Kane, it was Robert Wise's movie. He directed Star Trek: The Motion Picture, which was released, I think, December 8, 1979. That film wasn't finished. There's something that won't happen again. I guarantee you. A movie that is not completed is going to make its release date. They're just not going to do it. They're not going to do it. But the prints were still wet. That's what you're scared of. Print was still wet. The print was still wet, and there were a couple of special effects sequences that weren't finished. There's a moment in that particular cut where Kirk and Spock, they walk on what appears to be some kind of a bridge. The bridge is not finished. They should be falling into the ether, and somehow they're not. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about. But Orson Welles got paid a couple of $100,000 to narrate the trailer, and damned if he does not do a brilliant job of giving us the idea of the majesty of what Star Trek: The Motion Picture was going to be. Can't do it any better. Welles had a great speaking voice on top of all of his other stupendous talents. And yeah, he was only 70. He passed in October of 1985. And I remember when he died, I was in 6th grade. I was 12 years old. And I didn't really know that much about him from the movie perspective. I had heard of Citizen Kane, but I really thought that he was so well known because of the War of the Worlds radio broadcast, and not Citizen Kane. And oh my God, this is the guy. This is the most important filmmaker. Well, I didn't realize all of that until I got into my middle teens and started to read about movies. And not surprisingly, getting to New York University in the fall of 1994, almost every class, we learned something about Orson Welles that maybe we didn't know before. You know, it was mostly the pre-internet era, 1994, 95, 96. It existed, but nothing like the incredible amounts of knowledge that we have at our fingertips, literally. Didn't really work that way back then. There was so much information that they hadn't figured out how to get into the cloud, because there was no cloud. You know, in 1996, you didn't have the entirety of the New York Times going back to the early 1900s at the touch of a button. You still had to use microfilm. You still had to do more what you would call hands-on old school research. But Orson Welles, a galvanizing force, a transformative figure in a business that has been transformed and has transformed itself repeatedly since the beginning of cinema, since the days of Edward Muybridge and the days of Thomas Edison and Edwin S. Porter making movies together. Orson Welles, the most influential figure in the history of cinema, born 110 years ago today. This has been episode 505 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all so much for spending some of your Tuesday early evening here with me in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, peace.